Paris, March 1943. Smoke from the morning trains drifted through the narrow streets of Montparnasse, wrapping around the café awnings like a gray shroud. Inside a small café called Le Progrès, the hiss of the espresso machine covered the low murmur of conversation. To the German patrols walking past, it looked like any ordinary morning in occupied France. Couples whispering, old men reading papers, waiters polishing glasses. But beneath that veil of routine, a quiet war was unfolding. Hidden in the smell of roasted beans and tobacco smoke were secret messages, forged documents, and whispered coordinates. Each saucer placed on a table could signal a meeting. Each sugar cube the confirmation of an airdrop. Resistance Archives, Paris 1947. The café, once a symbol of Parisian leisure, had become the most unlikely battlefield of the war. Resistance fighters, students, postal clerks, artists, even priests, slipped between tables with the calm of practiced liars. They met in plain sight because nowhere else was safe. Apartments were raided nightly, forests swarmed with patrols, but the Gestapo could not raid every café in a city of 2 million. To the occupiers, the French were a conquered people. To the resistance, that arrogance was their first weapon. Gestapo Counterintelligence Report, June 1943. By 1943, the Nazi occupation of France had tightened like a noose. The Vichy government collaborated openly, deportations escalated, and food rationing starved morale. Yet underground networks, combat, liberation, and franc-tireur were growing bolder. The Allies needed eyes inside occupied territory, and cafés became their nerve centers. A chalk mark on a lamppost told couriers which café to enter. A folded newspaper on the counter meant a British drop had succeeded. Even the choice of drink mattered. Black coffee for safe, wine for danger. SEO Field Manual No. 12, 1942. The Gestapo knew something was wrong. Reports described inexplicable clusters of the same customers meeting weekly, often at odd hours. But cafés were the heart of French life. Closing them risked rebellion. So they watched instead, plain-clothed informants nursing drinks, listening for accents that didn't match. The resistance learned to fight back with theater. A couple would argue loudly at the next table to mask a whispered exchange. A spilled drink might interrupt a Gestapo inspection long enough for a courier to slip out the back. Their camouflage was culture itself. Bundesarchiv, Agent Report No. 441. Every morning, trains carried letters censored by German clerks, but within Paris, news moved faster by cup and saucer. A baker from the 11th arrondissement knew of an arms cache in the catacombs. A waitress near Pigalle memorized code phrases for railway sabotage. Orders from London, parachute drops, explosives, troop movements, were transcribed onto café receipts, then burned in ashtrays seconds later. The resistance lived by speed and invisibility. To exist was to deceive. U.S. Strategic Services Bulletin, 1944. By late spring, the Gestapo had traced several courier routes to Montmartre. They assumed messages traveled through churches or markets. They never guessed the true command posts were cafés named after poets and saints. One officer complained that the French meet too much. One cannot tell friend from conspirator. The truth was simpler. Everyone met because everyone needed to eat, drink, and talk. The resistance hid in the rhythm of daily life. German security police interrogation files, 1945. Inside Le Progrès, a former Sorbonne student named Luc Morel leaned over his notebook, pretending to write poetry. Across from him sat Jean Leroux, once a waitress, now a courier for Réseau-Patrie. Her handbag held microfilm photographs of railway bridges in Normandy. A small ring on her finger contained a cyanide capsule, insurance against capture. They spoke softly about Baudelaire, but between the lines, Jean slipped information, drop point, code phrase, contact time. One wrong glance, one curious waiter, and both would vanish into Frayne's prison. Frayne's detention records, 1943. The genius of the café network was decentralization. No single café knew another's operations. Messages passed through invisible chains. A waiter in Lyon might pass a name to a bookseller in Paris, who whispered it to a jazz pianist at La Rotonde, who slipped it to an SOE agent disguised as a photographer. Each link thought it was ordinary conversation. The Germans intercepted thousands of letters, but never decoded the rhythm of spoken French in its native habitat, the café. SEO Communication Analysis, 1945. The atmosphere was one of constant duality. Patrons laughed loudly to mask the tremor in their voices. The clink of glasses covered the rattle of fear. Radios hidden behind shelves crackled with BBC messages personnel-less. Cryptic phrases like "Jean les you blues," signaling sabotage missions. Sometimes, Allied airmen in hiding would sit quietly near the door, pretending to read. Their presence was both danger and hope. The cafés were sanctuaries dressed as distractions. BBC broadcast transcripts, 1943. Not every meeting ended in success. One afternoon, a man named Duval, a printer who forged IDs, was arrested outside café floor. Under torture, he refused to betray anyone. The Gestapo closed the café for inspection but found nothing except the usual chaos: lipstick-stained cups, half-empty bottles, and cigarette burns on wood. Within days, the same resistance group reconvened next door. They learned fast: rotate locations, change waiters, and vary the coffee orders. The dance continued, invisible and relentless. French Police Archive, 1946. By summer, the movement's lifeblood pulsed through these small rooms. Café owners became unsung heroes, providing cover and silence. Some hid weapons beneath wine crates. Others risked their families to shelter fugitives in basements. The café's clattering doors became the front lines of psychological warfare. To the French, sitting at a café table was defiance itself, a refusal to surrender normal life. To the occupiers, it was trivial routine. That misunderstanding kept the resistance alive. Café Owners Union Minutes, 1944. The Gestapo's frustration deepened. Reports complained of a phantom network moving among the tables. Every raid produced nothing but frightened civilians and the faint smell of burnt paper. One officer noted bitterly that Paris drinks and plots in the same breath. Behind that irony lay the truth. The French had turned conversation into camouflage. Gestapo Field Summary Number 318, 1944. At dusk, when curfew sirens wailed and boots echoed on cobblestones, the cafés dimmed their lights. Inside, whispers continued under candle glow. Maps unfolded like contraband scriptures. A dropped spoon might mean abort, and a raised eyebrow, go ahead. These rituals became language, one more secret code invisible to the enemy. Every night survived was a victory. Resistance Memoirs Collection, 1952. Still, danger stalked every corner. Informants crept in disguised as soldiers or delivery men. A single careless phrase could unravel months of work. Yet the cafés endured because they belonged to everyone. The Germans could occupy France, but they could not occupy its spirit: the shared table, the clatter of cups, the stubborn heartbeat of conversation. Post-War Cultural Studies Review, 1950. In the following months, as the Allies prepared for invasion, these hidden meetings would become the arteries of liberation. Every coded whisper inside a smoky café would ripple outward, to airfields in England, to saboteurs in the countryside, to generals studying maps of Normandy. And soon, the ordinary act of sitting down for coffee would help ignite the greatest uprising France had ever seen. Allied Operations Briefing Notes, May 1944. But that moment was still ahead. For now, in the dim light of occupied Paris, the resistance drank quietly, waited patiently, and fooled the Gestapo one more day. Because behind every espresso cup lay a promise that when the guns finally roared again, France would be ready. By the winter of 1943, the Gestapo's patience was breaking. Reports from the Sicherheitsdienst described a shadow army hidden in cafés. Yet raids yielded nothing but laughter and cigarette smoke. Their informants had failed to decipher how these rebels coordinated sabotage under their very noses. What the Germans could not grasp was the resistance's hidden advantage: a communication system born from improvisation and engineered through necessity, a network of human technology powered by memory, rhythm, and trust. Sicherheitsdienst Operational Brief, December 1943. The cafés functioned as living machines. Every waiter, chair, and sound became part of a coded mechanism. Glasses clinking twice might signal a safe approach. A radio burst from a back room marked a courier's arrival. At the center of this operation stood the couriers, young men and women trained by the British Special Operations Executive SOE. They carried invisible ink, hollow coins, and the smallest radios ever built for war, the Type 3 Mark II biscuit tin, weighing barely 12 pounds and fitting in a breadbasket. Its reach, up to 400 miles under ideal conditions, linked Paris to London nightly. Technical Manual TM SOE 3B 1943. Those signals carried code names like Athos, Seagull, and Cassandra. To the untrained ear, they were bursts of static, but to agents hunched over transmitters in back rooms, they were lifelines. Engineers at the Royal Signals Research Establishment fine-tuned frequencies so they could hop channels between broadcasts, avoiding detection by German direction-finding vans. A single 3-minute broadcast risked capture. Too long, and the signal would be triangulated. So resistance operators timed each message to the second, an invisible heartbeat between occupied France and Free Britain. Bureau of Communications Report, 1944. The enemy tried to match this ingenuity. German radio operators prowled Paris streets, their antennae swiveling like metal predators. But the café walls, thick with plaster, iron pipes, and human chatter, confused the readings. A signal could vanish behind a piano's vibration or a crowd's laughter. Allied engineers learned to exploit that chaos, transmit during music hours when sound waves masked static. The resistance was fighting not just with guns, but with acoustics. WWII Technical Analysis, 1944, Jean Leroux, the courier from Montparnasse, became part of that invisible orchestra. Each night, she delivered coded lists of railway timetables disguised as love letters. Her handwriting curled elegantly over invisible ink that would appear only under heat. Beneath her calm demeanor, she carried the weight of entire missions. Once, she met a contact disguised as a milkman near the Café Dome. Inside his cart lay detonators smuggled from a Renault factory. Their conversation lasted 64 seconds. 2 days later, a German supply train exploded near Tours. SOE mission debrief. April 1944. Factories like Renault, Citroën, and Hispano-Suiza played a double role, officially producing for the Reich, secretly sabotaging it. Workers inserted sand into crankcases, misaligned gear teeth, or etched invisible crosses on defective parts to track where sabotage succeeded. Engineers hid messages inside machinery manuals, coded by page numbers and torque values. Each piece of paper that passed through a café might carry a small revolution in its folds. Industrial Sabotage Summary, June 1944. One of the most sophisticated networks emerged from Lyon, the Cochise Line. Led by Jean Moulin under Charles de Gaulle's command, it linked resistance cells across 12 departments. The line depended on cafés as switchboards, each assigned a code color. Blue cafés handled intelligence. Red cafés stored weapons. Green cafés provided shelter. The Gestapo knew these existed, but not which were which. Moulin's system used the logic of the city itself, the way Parisians moved, ate, and met, to hide an army in plain sight. Bureau Central de Renseignements ETD Action Report, 1944. As Allied plans for D-Day took shape, the cafés transformed into operational theaters. Small tables became map boards. Menus hid orders for sabotage missions coded through wine prices. Chateau Margaux, 1940, might mean destroy Railway Line 40. The waiters, often veterans of 1918, knew when to move between tables to block lines of sight. Their precision rivaled any general staff. Resistance Coordination Memo, February 1944. The Germans, desperate, began Café Blitz operations, random raids in suspected districts. SS units stormed establishments, overturning tables, searching walls for secret compartments. But most of what they found were ordinary Parisians refusing to flinch. The resistance prepared for this too. Engineers embedded messages in the brass frames of mirrors, invisible unless heated. Microfilms were hidden inside cigarette filters. Even interrogation could not reveal what didn't exist on paper. Gestapo Field Directive, March 1944. One night in April 1944, the Gestapo surrounded a café near the Boulevard Saint-Michel. Inside, 12 resistance members met under the pretense of a poetry club. As boots thundered upstairs, the pianist began to play La Marseillaise. The customers rose instinctively, singing softly. In that moment, Jean Leroux slipped the critical microfilm, detailing German troop deployments near Cannes, into the pocket of a German officer who had come to inspect. He would walk it out unknowingly. 2 weeks later, that information reached London and shaped the timing of Operation Neptune. British Military Archives, Operation Neptune file. Behind every act of resistance stood anonymous inventors. In Toulouse, engineer René Carmil built the first resistance database, hijacking Nazi census machines to protect Jewish citizens. His methods inspired later Allied data encryption. In Paris, radio technician Robert Keller devised false ground wires that diverted German signals to empty lots. These unsung technicians were the nervous system of rebellion, operating between cafés and workshops. French Engineering Corps records, 1944. Meanwhile, the Gestapo's paranoia spread. They bugged cafés, replaced bartenders, and even poisoned sugar bowls to test reactions. But paranoia weakened them. Every gesture they mistrusted created more noise, more ghosts. The resistance fed that fear by planting false rumors, telling one informant that meetings moved to churches, another that they hid in brothels. In truth, the cafés remained sacred ground, too visible to suspect, too ordinary to destroy. Counterintelligence brief, May 1944. The climax came with the night of June 5, 1944. Across Paris, coded BBC messages began broadcasting. Les sanglots longs de violons de l'automne. The first line of a Verlaine poem told every resistance network that invasion was imminent. In cafés, waiters pretended to polish glasses while agents listened, pretending not to tremble. The second line, Blessant mon cœur d'une longueur monotone, confirmed it. D-Day would begin within 24 hours. BBC transmissions log, June 1944. In the café floor, Jean scribbled a final message on a napkin. All lights to be cut when guns sound. Around her, conversations continued as usual. But beneath the laughter, hearts pounded like artillery. At midnight, Paris's underworld awakened. Telegraph lines cut, trains derailed, bridges rigged. The cafés became command posts in the uprising that would soon engulf the city. Resistance Operational Summary, June 1944. When the first Allied paratroopers landed in Normandy hours later, the network built in cafés translated chaos into precision. German reinforcements failed to arrive on time because resistance sabotage delayed every train between Rouen and Cannes. The Gestapo, blind and deaf, had lost control of its own communications grid. Café tables had outmaneuvered headquarters. U.S. Army After-Action Report, August 1944, and as dawn broke over Paris, the same cafés that once hid whispers now echoed with the sound of liberation. Waiters wept as they served free coffee to soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms. The Gestapo's files, seized from burning offices, told a bitter truth. They had been defeated not just by armies, but by waiters, couriers, and lovers who used the smallest weapons: conversation, courage, and the illusion of normalcy. Post-War Intelligence Review, 1945. Still, amid victory, the ghosts of that hidden war lingered. The cafés bore bullet holes behind mirrors, scars on marble counters, and names scratched under tables, signatures of those who never returned. But their invention, that invisible web of coordination built from sound and trust, had changed warfare forever. And as the city prepared to rise, the resistance's greatest trick was yet to come. When Paris finally rose in August 1944, the sound was unlike any other battle of the war. It wasn't the thunder of artillery or the shriek of tanks. It was the roar of a city reclaiming its voice. Bells rang across districts long silenced by fear. Gunfire echoed between stone facades. And from the same cafés where whispers once decided sabotage, people shouted the forbidden word, liberté. U.S. Army Signal Corps, August 1944. The cafés that had once hidden codebooks now served as command centers for liberation. Radios blared Allied frequencies while waiters delivered messages alongside drinks. At Café de la Paix, an American war correspondent watched Parisians hoist captured German helmets on broomsticks. Across the street, a group of former waitresses used a wine ledger to coordinate barricades. The same instincts that once concealed resistance now fueled open defiance. Agents France Presse Dispatch, August 1944. What the Gestapo never realized was that the café's greatest weapon wasn't secrecy, it was rhythm. Over years of occupation, Parisians had developed an almost subconscious choreography, a way to move, signal, and vanish inside crowds. The resistance had harnessed that rhythm like a metronome for revolution. Société historique de la résistance, 1946. As Allied tanks rolled through the boulevards, they followed routes mapped months earlier on café napkins. Each red X, once a coded marker, now became a rendezvous for freedom. Resistance fighters guided columns with chalk arrows drawn on sidewalks, the same ones they'd used to mark safe entrances. The line between survival and victory was measured in street corners and whispers. U.S. Third Army Intelligence Report, September 1944. Behind the triumph lay a deeper transformation, how ordinary people had learned to wage an industrial war with human tools. France's engineers and technicians had turned their workshops into laboratories of defiance. Renault's foreman forged counterfeit work permits. Citroen's draftsmen designed fake blueprints to mislead German inspectors. Even the humble coffee grinder became a weapon, modified to hide pistol parts and miniature fuses. Every item of daily life had become dual-purpose, its surface innocent, its core lethal. French Industrial Archives, 1945. When post-war investigators traced the resistance networks, they found an astonishing pattern. Nearly half of all successful sabotage missions in occupied France began or ended in a café. Yet these operations accounted for less than 5% of the Gestapo's arrests. Statistically, cafés were safer than private apartments. Their brilliance lay in misdirection. They hid the extraordinary inside the ordinary. Sicherheitsdienst assessment, declassified 1952, psychologists later studied the phenomenon, calling it communal camouflage. In interviews with captured German officers, one theme recurred: they could not distinguish resistance from routine. Every conversation seemed both suspicious and harmless, every patron a potential spy. The paranoia corroded their efficiency. By 1944, morale reports among occupation forces in France described chronic unease, auditory hallucinations, and distrust of civilians. The cafés had defeated them psychologically long before Paris was freed. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division, 1946. For the French, these places became sanctuaries of identity. Under the clink of glasses, they had preserved their culture. Music banned by the Germans, jazz, swing, and chanson, had been kept alive in smoke-filled back rooms. Pianists who once distracted Gestapo raids returned to their stages, this time under tricolor flags. They were veterans too, their instruments scarred by the same war that took soldiers' limbs. French Ministry of Culture, post-war reconstruction files. The resistance's technical ingenuity reverberated far beyond France. British and American intelligence units studied their use of microsignals, learning to apply the same environmental encryption techniques. During the Cold War, the CIA later based parts of its safehouse communication doctrine on resistance café methods, embedding signals and social patterns rather than electronics. OSS Post-War Evaluation Report, 1947. The engineers behind the hidden technology received little fame. Robert Keller, the radio technician who masked signals through acoustic interference, died quietly in 1951, his name absent from official histories. René Carmel, who reprogrammed Nazi census machines to hide Jewish citizens, perished in Dachau before liberation. Their work, recovered from notebooks and dismantled transmitters, influenced post-war data security and early computing principles. French Academy of Sciences Journal, 1953. In the cafés themselves, scars remained. Some kept the bullet holes, refusing to plaster over memory. Others framed resistance armbands beside espresso machines. Waiters who once risked death for coded gestures now told their stories to wide-eyed students. But beneath the nostalgia lingered a truth often too heavy for words, that courage had not come from glory, but from endurance. Musée de la Résistance, Paris, 1958. As the years passed, historians sought to measure the resistance's impact. Military analysts estimated that by June 1944, French sabotage operations reduced German transport capacity by nearly 20%, enough to delay reinforcements to Normandy by crucial days. Yet even more decisive was the morale shift. Civilians across Europe, hearing of the cafés that defied the Gestapo, realized that resistance could exist within routine life, that rebellion didn't always wear a uniform. U.S. Army European Theater Review, 1946, but liberation carried contradictions. Some cafés that once hosted patriots were accused of collaboration. Some waiters had served both masters to survive. The post-war trials blurred the lines between resistance and compromise. In truth, most Parisians had lived in the gray space between fear and defiance. The cafés reflected that ambiguity, places where a nod could mean salvation or betrayal. Commission d'Epuration Civique, 1947. Still, when de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, he saluted not only soldiers but also citizens. His radio broadcast that evening praised the France that fought with pencils, printing presses, and the murmur of cafés. The line became iconic, carved into memorials across the country. For the first time, the café was recognized not just as a social space, but as a battlefield of intellect and courage. Office Français de l'Information, 1944. In the decades that followed, filmmakers and novelists romanticized the resistance's smoke-lit meetings. But historians continued to uncover the quiet precision behind the legend. What appeared to be improvisation had been systematic, rotating venues, calculated distractions, and mathematical timing of patrol gaps. It was artistry meeting logistics, a new form of warfare that fused emotion with engineering. Université de la Sorbonne Historical Review, 1960. Modern analysts call it the prototype of networked resistance. The same principles, the diffusion of leadership, the blending of communication with culture, would later define insurgencies, civil rights movements, and even cyber warfare. In every case, the lesson endured. Strength lies not only in firepower but in connection. Rand Strategic Doctrine Analysis, 1972. On anniversaries of the liberation, the descendants of those fighters still gather at the same tables. They raise glasses not to victory alone, but to the idea that humanity can hide freedom inside the rituals of daily life. Tourists pass by, unaware that the marble counter once hid explosives or that a scratched pattern on the floor once marked a dead drop. Beneath the chatter of modern Paris, echoes of defiance still hum. Le Monde, Commemorative Edition, 1984. The Gestapo once described the cafés as the veins of an invisible city. They were right, but they misunderstood the heart that pumped through them. It wasn't ideology or even revenge. It was ordinary people refusing to surrender what made them human: conversation, music, and warmth. Out of that humanity, they built a weapon the occupiers could never decode. Bundesarchiv, Psychological Warfare File. Today, when Parisians sip coffee on quiet mornings, few notice the faint etchings under the tabletops, the initials of those who met in shadows. They remind us that the resistance was not forged in secret bunkers or mountain passes, but in the public pulse of a city that learned to fight by pretending to live. National Museum of Resistance, Paris, because in the end, the cafés of occupied France taught the world something no textbook could capture: that freedom can hide in plain sight, survive through ritual, and triumph through rhythm. And perhaps that is why, even now, when sunlight strikes the glasses at just the right angle, you can almost hear them whisper the words that once defied an empire: "À la liberté."